I thank the distinguished ranking member of the Budget Committee for yielding, and I would pose a question to him, if I might. I heard him on the floor earlier say and put a chart up that suggested that the term balanced had been used 191 times by the other side in the course of this debate. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, it strikes me...
We probably missed a few.
Yeah, that may be an incomplete count. 191 times the word balance has been used, and as the senator from Alabama very fittingly pointed out, there is nothing that balances about this budget. In fact, this budget doesn't balance in 10 years. It doesn't balance ever. And the other thing that I would suggest to my colleague from Alabama is that in the course of the debate, it's become clear to me, and I think to the others, anybody who's been observing this, that the so-called balanced approach, which they advocate, is anything but that. You've got $1.5 trillion tax increase. You've got spending increase 62% over the course of the next decade, and a net spending increase, notwithstanding their assertions that somehow this is a reduction in spending. So the whole idea that this is a, quote, balanced approach strikes me as a big charade. And I think that's what this entire budget is. And in fact, that's why all the editorial pages across the country, including those from newspapers that are not considered the least bit conservative. In fact, many of us here in the chamber on this side expect most of the newspapers around the country and their editorial pages to attack Republicans and Republican budgets, but they have absolutely eviscerated in their editorial comments the budget that's been put forward by the Senate Democrats. And I think it's simply because it is anything but balanced. And I guess when they use the word balance 191 times here on the floor of the Senate with regard to this debate, but if you think about the, quote, balanced approach that they talk about, even the fiscal cliff, you know, they keep talking about a balanced approach. Fiscal cliff, there was no balance there. It was all tax increases, $620 billion tax increase. And over the course of the president's first term, we got $1 trillion tax increase with Obamacare. You add those things together with some other tax increases that have been added on. It's over $1.7 trillion in new taxes, new revenues, as they say. We want balance. Well, you got $1.7 trillion in new revenue already. And then they're talking about another $1.5 trillion in taxes. Really? I mean, where's the balance in that? This is all about raising taxes, growing government at the expense of the economy. And I would say to my colleague from Alabama, we're going to vote on an amendment here pretty soon by the senator from New Hampshire, Senator Ayotte, which raises a point of order against any tax increase that would occur until the unemployment rate gets back down to 5.5%. Because 5.5% is what the administration said back in 2009, the President and the White House said, would be the unemployment rate by now without the stimulus. And it's hard to feature that after spending $1 trillion borrowed from our children and grandchildren to, quote, stimulate the economy, and still have an unemployment rate that hovers around 8%, that they would be talking about yet more taxes when we know that raising taxes does nothing but hurt the economy and hurt job growth. And so if the real goal here is to get the economy growing and expanding again, and I know my colleague from Alabama shares my view, that the best way to get deficits and debt under control is to get an expanding economy where you have people who are working again, people who are investing again, people therefore are paying taxes. You get not less revenue but more when you have a growing economy. And that's what we ought to be for here. But this budget does the opposite. It doubles down on government. It dramatically increases spending. It adds $7.3 trillion to the federal debt and raises $1.5 trillion in new taxes on top of the $1.7 trillion tax increases that we've already seen in the last 4 years under this administration. This is a completely wrong-headed approach, which is why it's not just the Republicans in this chamber who are saying that. It is the independent folks out there, or so-called independent folks out there in the media who on their editorial pages are calling this what it is. It is a charade. There is nothing about this exercise that we're going through here on the Senate floor this week that will solve the nation's fiscal problems, nor get people back to work or get this economy growing again. And I would say that in terms of a budget is supposed to confront harsh realities. It's supposed to set a vision and a blueprint and a pathway for the future. Well, if this is their pathway, ignoring the problem, sweeping under the carpet the long-term structural challenges that we face with regard to Social Security and Medicare, this does nothing to protect those programs. Nothing. There's no reform in here. There isn't anything in here that prolongs these programs that people rely on today that are headed toward bankruptcy. And furthermore, at the end of this decade, according to the Congressional Budget Office, are going to represent 91% of all federal spending. Think about that. 91% of all federal spending composed of mandatory programs. 9% of the entire budget left over to pay interest on the debt, national security, and all the other discretionary things that the government funds. This budget does nothing to address the long-term structural fiscal imbalances that face this country, and yet it relies on the same old tried and failed policy. Well, let's just raise taxes a little more, and it'll simply be a tax increase on the rich because Lord knows we are the defenders of the middle class. Well, let me tell you folks, if you're a middle class person in this country, you cannot raise taxes enough on the rich to do all the things they want to do in the form of growing government and increasing spending. This is going to hit and penetrate middle-income Americans. Middle-class families are going to get hit with higher taxes because the appetite to spend on the other side is endless. It just goes on and on and on. We aren't doing anything to address that. We have a spending problem in this country, Mr. President, not a revenue problem, not a tax problem. It isn't that we spend too little, or that we tax too little, it's that we spend too much. And that's what we need to address in this budget. And that's where this budget falls terribly, terribly short. It is an incredible disappointment to finally, after 4 years, have a budget on the floor of the United States Senate that is so inadequate to the nation's challenges in the future and that relies on the same old failed policy of raising taxes, which we know hurts economic growth, hurts job creation. We're still hovering at 8% unemployment. We've got already in the last 4 years $6 trillion added to the federal debt. We've got a sluggish economy that's growing at 1.5% to 2%, and for the 4-year average, less than 1%, when we know that the 60-year historical average is 3.3% economic growth. If we got just to back to a normal economic growth pattern, average over the last 60 years, it would do, if you look at what these fiscal challenges that we face would be so much smaller by comparison simply because a growing economy helps address all these problems that we're talking about today. But unfortunately, the budget that we have before us doesn't focus on growing the economy. It focuses rather on growing the government. And that is where it falls so miserably short. And it really is unfortunate that that's the vote that we're going to have today. Now, many of the amendments, as I said, that we're going to be voting on are an attempt to improve it. I hope that the AOT amendment will pass, that the tax increases that are included in this budget, the point of order will be approved that would lie against any tax increase until we get that unemployment rate back down to 5.5%, because that's where it should be. And if we had a growing economy, that is in all likelihood, it would be a lot closer to that number. And so I would just support the good efforts of my colleague from Alabama. He has been down here on the floor many, many hours in the last couple of days doing yeoman's work, pointing out the shortcomings in this budget that we're considering here before the United States Senate and laying out a very different vision for how we can solve these problems. But I have to say, finally, Mr. President, one last time, this budget, it's really ironic, because I'm sure this is a very poll-tested phrase. I'm sure,
Senator, the minority time has expired.
I would yield back the time and give our colleagues an opportunity to use the term balanced a few more times before this debate concludes. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.